The chamber was filled with voices that carried the weight of entire civilizations, yet one voice rose above them all, hard and commanding. The alien general, towering in his ornate armor, declared before the assembly that Earth would kneel or be broken. His words were delivered without hesitation, a proclamation meant not just for humanity but for the galaxy to witness. To him, it was already decided: humans were new, untested, unworthy of the stars. The tribute he demanded was not gold or resources, but obedience, a symbol that the last independent world in the spiral would bow to the Empire's supremacy. Every syllable was laced with contempt. He spoke of humanity as if they were children playing with weapons they could not understand, reckless primitives who had stumbled into the void without permission. He mocked their small fleet, their fragmented alliances, their lack of centuries-old experience in the galactic order. He pointed to the Empire's conquests as proof: hundreds of species had once resisted, and all had fallen. Earth would be no different, he claimed, unless it learned to recognize its place. The chamber murmured with agreement from many of the gathered delegations. For them, humanity was an inconvenience, a minor flare of defiance soon to be extinguished. Some ambassadors smirked, others whispered disdain. Only a handful shifted uneasily, recalling too clearly the stubborn refusal of humans to yield even when outmatched. Still, the general's authority was absolute in that moment, and his words filled the silence with the certainty of domination. Earth's representatives, dressed in plain attire that contrasted against the jeweled robes and glowing sigils of the other species, tried to interject with calm appeals to sovereignty. They spoke of peaceful coexistence, of humanity's right to chart its own course. But they were dismissed almost instantly. The general waved a clawed hand as if shooing away insects. His message was not a negotiation but an ultimatum: tribute or annihilation. The arrogance in his tone was deliberate, meant to crush any spark of resistance before it could take hold. He listed the consequences with chilling precision: blockades that would starve their cities, precision strikes that would silence their defenses, orbital bombardments that would turn their continents into ash. He promised it all with the certainty of a predator long accustomed to feeding on fear. And he smiled when he said it, a smile that told the room he relished the destruction he threatened. Humanity's delegation sat in silence, not from weakness but from the recognition that words had no weight here. The Empire did not bargain with those it considered beneath it. Around the chamber, alien eyes watched closely, waiting for the humans to crack, to fold under the weight of inevitability. They expected pleas, concessions, perhaps even the desperate promise of obedience. But none came. The general misread the silence as submission. He leaned forward, his voice swelling with triumph as he painted the picture of Earth's future under his rule. He promised them survival if they obeyed, prosperity if they surrendered, extinction if they defied. Each word carried the assumption that there was no alternative, no scenario where humanity could truly resist. Yet beneath the surface of his words, tensions simmered. Some in the chamber had heard faint whispers of battles gone wrong when humans were involved, skirmishes where numbers had not guaranteed victory, stories of soldiers who fought long after their wounds should have ended them. But those were dismissed as anomalies, accidents of fortune rather than patterns of strength. The general's booming voice drowned them out, smothering any thought that Earth could be more than prey. As his speech reached its peak, he struck the floor with the haft of his ceremonial weapon, a final punctuation that reverberated through the hall. He declared that humanity had 3 cycles to deliver their tribute or suffer annihilation. His tone carried the weight of inevitability, the certainty of an empire that had never been defied successfully. The chamber erupted in approving echoes, voices raised in agreement, the sound of predators convinced they had cornered their next meal. Through it all, the humans did not flinch. Their leader's face remained composed, unreadable, giving nothing away. No protest rose from their side, no promise of obedience, no hint of fear. The general took their quiet as the first crack in their spirit, the beginning of submission. He laughed, a deep, echoing sound that filled the chamber with mockery. To him, the game was already won, the prey already broken. What he did not understand was that the silence was not surrender. It was calculation, the stillness of a predator biding its time, the calm before the strike. The general mistook it for weakness, as so many before him had. He believed humanity had been cowed, that their spirit would bend as easily as others had. And in that arrogance, he sealed the first crack in his own fate. Among the alien ranks, the general's decree echoed far beyond the chamber. Soldiers stationed across fleets and garrisons carried his words with them, repeating the promise of Earth's downfall as though it were inevitable. Yet, in the hushed corners of barracks and mess halls, other voices surfaced, softer, trembling, and far less certain. They spoke of encounters that official records rarely acknowledged, battles where human forces had defied every expectation and left survivors scarred in ways no medicine could mend. Whispers grew around firelight and within the shadows of troop transports. Veterans leaned closer, lowering their tones as though the very sound of their memories carried danger. They recalled skirmishes on fringe worlds, raids that should have been routine sweeps but became nightmares. One survivor described human soldiers fighting with a relentlessness that ignored injury, exhaustion, or fear. Another swore that a small detachment of them had held an entire ridge for days against overwhelming numbers, leaving the ground littered with alien bodies while their own dead seemed fewer than should have been possible. The reports never reached official councils intact. Commanders dismissed them as exaggerations born from panic. But among those who had faced humanity directly, the terror was not exaggeration, it was truth carved into memory. The most unsettling stories were not about human fleets or strategies, but about the individuals within them. Soldiers whispered of fighters who moved like hunters, silent and precise, turning the battlefield into a place of stalking shadows rather than orderly engagement. Aliens accustomed to overwhelming firepower found themselves unnerved by the way humans adapted, improvised, and pressed forward even when cornered. It was said that killing one human rarely ended the fight, because the others would rise with a fury that seemed more animal than civilized. For species that had long believed fear was the ultimate weapon, the realization that humanity used it as fuel was deeply disturbing. Amid these scattered accounts, one tale carried a weight heavier than all the rest. It was not spoken in full sentences but in fragments, like an invocation of something best left unnamed. They called him the Boogeyman. Some claimed he was a soldier forged in the chaos of Earth's wars, a figure of flesh and blood who had walked through the ashes of destroyed battalions without a scratch. Others swore he was an idea, a specter conjured by humanity itself, given life on battlefields where terror thrived. His legend stretched from one regiment to another, evolving each time, but its essence remained unchanged. Wherever the Boogeyman was said to appear, entire units vanished. To alien strategists, the myth was dismissed as nonsense, a coping mechanism invented by weak-minded soldiers. Yet among those who had fought closest to humans, the myth carried the ring of truth. Some described his voice as calm, colder than the void, promising no quarter. Others insisted they had seen his eyes glowing in the dark, a predator's gaze that stripped courage away. Even when skeptics laughed, their laughter was brittle, the kind that covered unease rather than conviction. As the Empire's propaganda machines broadcast the general's ultimatum across the stars, these whispered legends spread with equal speed in the places propaganda never reached. The stories clung to every soldier who had once faced the humans and lived, shaping their nights with nightmares and their days with unease. The Boogeyman was never officially recognized, but his presence was undeniable in the way seasoned warriors tightened their grips on their weapons at the mention of Earth. The general himself mocked the fear openly, calling it weakness. Before his officers he declared the Boogeyman nothing more than a tale to frighten children. He laughed at the notion that a single human could embody such dread, and his confidence seemed unshakable. Yet in private, when the lights dimmed and the chamber fell silent, even he could not fully ignore the thought of what such a figure represented. A symbol like that, even if imagined, had power. It suggested that humanity did not merely fight wars, they inspired terror by their very nature. For the council, the legends were brushed aside as irrelevant. For the common soldier, they were warnings whispered like prayers. The Empire prepared its fleets with arrogance, convinced Earth would bow. But in the minds of those who would carry out the conquest, unease festered. They wondered if tribute and surrender were the only paths for survival, or if standing against humanity meant awakening the very nightmare they hoped was only rumor. They wondered if the Boogeyman would answer. The Empire expected more silence from Earth, perhaps a plea for mercy or a reluctant acceptance of terms. What arrived instead was a transmission unlike anything the Council had prepared for. It did not come wrapped in ceremony, no entourage of diplomats speaking in circles, no carefully chosen language meant to soothe. It was a single voice, calm and steady, transmitted across the chamber with a clarity that cut through every layer of pomp and noise. The speaker was human, his presence stripped of ornamentation, his features worn by years of battle. His expression was not hostile, yet it carried no trace of submission. He spoke as though the Council's threats had never been voiced. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Every syllable was deliberate, chosen with precision, and weighted with meaning. He reminded the gathered assembly of humanity's long history, not in the stars but on Earth itself. He spoke of an origin forged in extinction events, of survival through fire, ice, and famine. He recalled that humanity had risen not because the world was kind but because it was merciless, and in facing that mercilessness, they had learned endurance. Empires had risen over them, tyrants had ruled them, armies had enslaved them, yet always they had broken their chains. He did not recite myths or legends but facts etched in blood and time, each one a testament that humanity had never accepted permanent defeat. The council chamber, usually restless with interruptions and posturing, grew unnervingly still. Alien dignitaries who had jeered at Earth's weakness now found themselves listening without breath, compelled not by volume but by certainty. The human voice carried no plea, no request, only conviction. He acknowledged the demand for tribute, acknowledged the general's ultimatum, and then dismissed it with chilling simplicity. He said that humanity did not kneel, not to conquerors, not to gods, not to fear itself. He said that the attempt to force submission would not secure dominance, but only guarantee destruction. When he delivered the words that followed, the silence in the chamber thickened until it felt like gravity itself pressed down upon them. You demanded tribute. Here is our answer, we'll end. There was no embellishment, no added flourish, only a promise uttered with such cold assurance that it left no room for interpretation. It was not bluster, not the reckless bravado of prey cornered, but the steady declaration of a predator speaking the truth of its nature. The general attempted to laugh, but his amusement sounded strained, a hollow effort to mask the ripple of unease spreading through the hall. His mockery faltered because even he could not fully ignore the weight behind the words. He had faced countless species, had broken defiance more times than he could count, yet something in the human's voice unsettled him. It was not that the man threatened war, many had done that before, but that he spoke as if war was already decided, as if humanity's path forward was inevitable, written in the marrow of its people. Other council members exchanged uneasy glances, their arrogance dimming. For the first time, the certainty of conquest was shaken. A few remembered old reports they had dismissed, fragments of stories about soldiers who would not die, fleets that fought far past their capacity, people who endured suffering that would have crushed any other race. Now those fragments aligned with the voice before them, and doubt grew heavy in their minds. The human did not linger after his words. He did not argue, did not attempt persuasion. He ended the transmission as abruptly as it began, leaving the chamber suspended in the echo of his declaration. The council was left not with the sound of debate but with silence, the kind that gnaws deeper than noise. The general, still seated in pride, struggled to regain composure. His claws clenched against the armrest of his throne, the first visible crack in his certainty. Across the galaxy, as the transmission spread, its impact was immediate. To soldiers who had feared the Boogeyman in whispers, it felt like confirmation that the nightmare was real, not a ghost but a living will of Earth. To leaders who had laughed at human bravado, it carried the weight of inevitability. And to the general who had demanded tribute, it was a reminder that arrogance could blind even the most powerful. Humanity had spoken, and their answer was not surrender. It was finality. The Empire believed numbers would crush defiance, as they always had. Fleets were dispatched in disciplined waves, armored divisions assembled with precision, and commanders boasted of swift victory. Yet when the first encounters unfolded, certainty fractured. Human ships were not the largest, nor the most advanced, but they moved with a cohesion that turned every skirmish into a trap. Formations shifted in ways the Empire's tacticians could not predict, striking where weakness was assumed impossible. Fleets that expected an easy hunt found themselves bleeding losses before they realized the battle had truly begun. On the ground, the difference was even starker. Alien troops marched with overwhelming numbers, their confidence rooted in centuries of conquest. They expected humans to hold ground clumsily or retreat in panic. Instead, they discovered something entirely foreign, relentless resistance that adapted faster than any doctrine had prepared for. Positions thought broken would suddenly reemerge with coordinated counterstrikes. Soldiers who should have been scattered regrouped with uncanny speed, turning ruins into fortresses and ambushes into nightmares. Every advance was answered not with retreat but with a cunning ferocity that drained momentum. Stories began to filter back to command posts. Patrols vanished without warning, convoys destroyed in silence, outposts left in ruins with no sign of struggle except for the trail of bodies. The phrase whispered in barracks took on a new edge: the Boogeyman walks. At first, officers punished such talk, calling it weakness, but fear spread faster than discipline could suppress. Veterans who had mocked the idea began to wonder whether the nightmare was stalking them after all. The Empire's commanders tried to overwhelm the humans with sheer force, unleashing bombardments meant to erase resistance. Yet even in the face of firepower designed to obliterate, survivors emerged from ash and rubble, counterattacking with precision that defied explanation. Where other species broke under terror, humanity grew sharper, colder, more dangerous. To fight them was to awaken something primal, something that did not die with defeat but grew stronger through it. What unsettled alien soldiers most was not just the human capacity to kill but their refusal to be broken. They fought with a discipline that felt unnatural, not bound by fear of death but driven by the certainty of purpose. Wounds that should have ended combat became fuel for further strikes. A soldier bleeding out would use his last strength to drag an enemy down with him. Units cut off behind enemy lines continued fighting long after command declared them lost. The Empire, which had built its rule on crushing spirit as much as body, could not comprehend a foe whose spirit only hardened when tested. The general himself received reports that his legions were faltering, not for lack of strength but because morale was unraveling. He dismissed them at first, blaming incompetence, yet the pattern repeated too often to ignore. Alien soldiers whispered of shadows moving through forests, of cold eyes watching from ruined cities, of voices over comms promising nothing but their end. The Boogeyman was no longer a myth. It was the face they gave to every human strike that shattered their certainty. In desperation, the Empire escalated. More fleets poured in, resources drained, strategies rewritten. Still, every victory cost them more than expected, every gain was temporary, every defeat more devastating than the last. It was not just war. It was attrition of the soul. They realized too late that humanity did not fight to preserve ground or honor, but to end threats entirely. For every demand of tribute, the response was destruction. For every attempt to enslave, the answer was annihilation. The general, who had once mocked Earth as insignificant, now faced reports of legions refusing to deploy, soldiers breaking ranks at the mere rumor of human presence. The Empire had believed fear was their greatest weapon, but now it was turned against them, sharper and more merciless than they had ever wielded. And behind that fear was not just an army, not just a planet, but a people united in one promise: they would never kneel. The war that had begun as a show of dominance ended in humiliation for the Empire. What was meant to be a swift lesson for a lesser species had dragged into a campaign that bled them of soldiers, ships, and morale. Entire battalions vanished in ruined cities where humans fought like wraiths, fleets returned half-shattered after clashing with vessels that should have been outgunned, and whispers of the Boogeyman no longer lingered in shadows but spread like fire. The council that once cheered the demand for tribute now sat in uneasy silence, watching reports of defeat pile higher with every passing cycle. The alien general, once so certain of victory, could no longer escape the weight of failure. His forces were fractured, his soldiers demoralized, and his empire shaken. The very defiance he had promised to crush now stood unbroken before him. In the end, the general himself was seized, not in a triumphant battle but in the hollow surrender of a campaign that had collapsed under its own arrogance. Brought before humanity, he faced the reversal of his own ultimatum. The proud warrior who once demanded submission now stood as the one forced to endure it. The human who had spoken before, the calm voice that had carried across the chamber, was the one to confront him. There was no cruelty in his manner, no gloating triumph. He did not raise his tone or embellish his words. He looked at the general as one predator would regard another who had overreached. With steady clarity, he explained what the Empire had never understood. Humanity had not sought this war, had not desired conquest, had not asked for tribute. All they had ever wanted was respect, the simple recognition of their right to exist unbowed. But when respect was denied and chains were threatened, humanity's answer was not to yield. It was to ensure the chains were broken forever. The general tried to cling to pride, speaking of regrouping, of vengeance, of the inevitability of the Empire's return. Yet his words rang hollow. He had seen too much, heard too many accounts of soldiers crushed by fear, fleets disintegrated by determination that refused to die. The certainty that once marked his speech was gone, replaced by the desperation of one who knew the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. Humanity had proven that it was not prey. It was not weak. It was a force that could not be bent, and in its refusal to bow lay the seeds of the Empire's undoing. The message was not meant only for the general. Humanity allowed the council to witness his fall, to hear the lesson delivered without spectacle. The human voice, calm and unwavering, declared that Earth did not seek dominance but would never again tolerate demands for submission. If the galaxy chose peace, humanity would walk beside it. If it chose tyranny, humanity would dismantle it piece by piece until nothing remained. The warning carried no threat of excess, only the certainty of resolve. It was not fury but clarity, a promise etched into the memory of every species that listened. When the words ended, the silence was deeper than any applause. For the first time, the Empire's leaders felt the full weight of what humanity represented. Not an upstart world to be disciplined, but a predator that had learned to stand against extinction itself. To demand tribute from such a people had been folly. To mistake silence for weakness had been fatal. From that moment forward, the galaxy would remember. They would remember the arrogance that had brought an empire to its knees, the battles where certainty was shattered by defiance, and the calm promise of a voice that needed no roar to inspire fear. They would remember that humanity had no desire to rule, but every capacity to end those who sought to break them. The lesson was seared into history: Earth could not be conquered. It could only be respected, or feared.